Thank you, Connie, for that wonderful introduction. Um, by the way, I was right before this at Evolocity, which is this really cool electric vehicle company in Torrance. And so they need Southern California Edison's help. But I was there with my amazing staff, Nico, my district director, and Aurelia, my field representative. And of course, my staff asked the one super important question, which is, hey, are you a member of the Torrance Area Chamber of Commerce? Turns out they're not, so you just might want to, say hi to them. All right. So it's my honor to be here along with the Congresswoman Maxine Waters. And the only reason we're even here today is because we funded government last Friday. So sometimes we set out low expectations of American people, and then sometimes we meet them. But I do want to say what an amazing experience it is to be able to work with Maxine Waters. She's a national treasure. And before she became chair, she was in the minority party. And for a very long time, she kept talking and warning us about the excesses of Wall Street. And had we all listened to her last decade, I'm not sure that this recession that Wall Street caused would have happened. I'm so glad that our colleagues elected her as chair of financial services. She's going to do an amazing job and look out for all Americans. So we should give her a big round of applause. And also recognize her husband, Sydney, and all that you do for public service and having been an ambassador. So thank you for your service to the nation as well. And sitting next to Maxine is the love of my life, my wife, Betty. And as some of you may know, she was recently elected to a Torrance school board. And I want to recognize the Torrance City Mayor, Pat Fury, and his wife, Terry, for their leadership of Torrance, as well as other Torrance council members. And to my friend Leroy and his staff for all you do for Torrance. I see Superintendent George Mannon of the Torrance Unified School District. Thank you for being here. And want to recognize Don Lee on the Torrance School Board, and you have the very best school board in the nation, just being objective about that. And thank you, Donna, for your leadership of the Torrance Chamber, and John for your leadership as well. So I'm going to touch on three issues. The first will be on what is happening locally. Then I'm going to talk to you about what is happening in Washington, D.C., and then I'm going to conclude on Yemen, because very few people ever talk about Yemen. So in terms of what's happening locally, the first is infrastructure. I was pleased to have worked with Congresswoman Waters and other members on a bipartisan basis to make sure we got full Phase 1 funding for Metro. We'll continue to make sure we give Metro the funding that they need to build out light rail and subways in Los Angeles, Southern California. And we're working with Metro to make sure that we take the Green Line all the way down here to Torrance. And in addition, we were able to stop Metro from putting in a sort of stupid plan that was going to make it hard for South Bay folks to access the Metro and require more than one stop. So we were able to make sure that that didn't happen. In terms of other infrastructure, last term I introduced a bill that would provide $2 trillion of infrastructure funding across America. If you look at the American Society for Civil Engineers report, they say we have a $4 trillion infrastructure deficit. But when I introduced that legislation, even some of my colleagues in my caucus said, oh, that's too expensive. You might have remembered last year when the president gave a State of the Union, he talked about infrastructure, and then he mentioned the figure 1.5 trillion. So I said, see, I wasn't that far off. So I think there's an ability to work together, and hopefully we can get legislation done on infrastructure. Locally, we also do have a homelessness problem. It is something that affects some cities more than others. Much of this is done at the city and county level. However, there are some members who are homeless who happen to be veterans. And so the federal government does have programs to help veterans. Now, one is called HUD-VASH, so it will provide the HUD part, which is housing, and then it provides services through the VASH part. So if you know of any veterans who may be homeless or on the verge of becoming homeless, please let Congresswoman Waters or I know, and we will help them. One of the first bills I got signed into law also revitalized the West LA VA, the largest VA in the nation. It also services Torrance residents. And at its full build out, that will allow the entire campus to have over 1,000 units for housing homeless veterans. We were able to get one building opened up and running a few months ago. We'll plan to get more up and running. And it is an issue that the federal government does actually have resources to help homeless veterans. And then, thank you. And then, in terms of other local issues, I do want to let you know, as some of you may know, I grew up in a family business. I worked in a family business. I worked actually as a kid in a family business because we were free labor. And, but it's very clear to me how important businesses are to not just communities, but to making sure that our economy continues to grow and prosper. So thank you all for everything that you do in terms of helping the community and helping the economy thrive and prosper here in the South Bay. By the way, I have heard, so Congresswoman Waters and I have gone to other events, and I just want to confirm she's actually never said so-and-so chamber is the best in America. So that's quite a compliment to you. So, yeah. And then the last local issue I'm going to touch on is I will shortly be introducing legislation. I sit on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and it's pretty clear to me that diplomacy happens at a lot of different levels, not just the federal level. So we have a huge number of exchanges that happen within cities of one country and another country. We have city governments that do exchanges between one country and another country. And so what this legislation will do is provide State Department resources to local cities and counties who want to engage in this kind of outreach. And so hopefully we can get that done this term. So in terms of what's happening in the Capitol, I'm not going to be partisan here. I'm just going to be descriptive of what happened last November. So one party ran on lowering healthcare costs, on investing in infrastructure, and on cleaning up corruption in DC. The other party ran on building the wall. The American people made a decision in November, and so Democrats now control the House of Representatives. And for the first year, the House of Representatives is going to deliver on those promises that were made. So I'm just going to talk to you about some of the legislation that is going to come out the first 6 months. We're going to pass out H.R. 1, which is a bill that will reform campaign finance laws, get rid of, as much as we can, corruption in D.C., and also protect voting rights. So that'll be one of the first bills that we'll send out. We also will pass out H.R. 8, which is background checks for guns. I'm on the House Judiciary Committee. Last week, we passed this legislation out of the committee after 10 hours of debate. It was the first gun legislation in over a decade to pass out of this committee, and we intend to get it off the floor of the House by later this month. It has 97% support among the American public, including many gun owners. And what it essentially does is it closes loopholes in background checks. I call it really violent history checks. That's mostly what these background systems are checking for. So right now, if you were to go to a gun dealer and you want to buy a gun, you would submit your information, they run a background check. In 90% of the cases, it takes about a couple minutes, and then you'll get the result. But for some cases, it takes a little bit longer. Right now, there's sort of a 3-day period. So you could do that and get a gun. Or you could just go to a gun show and buy a gun. No background check, no ID check, nothing. Which makes it sort of silly, right? You have an entire system set up and then people can simply do that. There's additional other loopholes that this bill will close. It is also bipartisan. And so it is our hope that, well, first of all, it will pass the House. It's our hope that the US Senate could also pass it because it does have bipartisan support. Another piece of legislation we're going to pass out is the Equality Act. So right now in America, there are still states where you can get fired based on who you love. And what this bill will do is basically take the Civil Rights Act and put in LGBT so that you cannot be discriminated against based on your status. And we're also going to pass out legislation on reducing healthcare costs in terms of drugs. So there's two things going on. One is prescription drugs, another is generic drugs. I was on the House Oversight Committee in my first term, and we were seeing these spikes in generic drugs, which makes no sense, right? There is no R&D for generic drugs. None of their arguments that pharmaceutical companies use for drug pricing would actually apply to generic drugs. So we were wondering, how come you're getting these massive spikes in generic drugs, some of which help AIDS victims, cancer victims, and other folks. So it turned out that because of the way the FDA operated, there was about a 7 to 8 year delay, backlog, whatever you want to call it, in terms of allowing another manufacturer to make the same generic drug. So some of these companies figured out they can buy a generic drug, and then they would have about 7 years where they could charge any price they want and have basically zero competition. So after we sort of figured that out, we held hearings, we went after the FDA on a bipartisan basis, and the FDA committed that they would lower that timeline to about 8 months. So hopefully we'll see generic drug prices start to drop, and it is simply one of those problems that a monopoly was inadvertently created because of what the FDA was doing. And then in terms of prescription drugs, there will be legislation coming out on that as well. We're also going to be putting out legislation on infrastructure. It's clear that the majority of American people want to see something done on infrastructure. So in addition to building roads, bridges, and highways, my view is in the 21st century, we also have to talk about cyber as part of our infrastructure. It is not good that we've had dams in the United States that have been hacked, right? That's not a good thing. So we need to protect our critical assets in terms of cybersecurity, and then we have to make sure we get rural broadband everywhere in America. So I think that will be a pretty significant piece of legislation. Because it is really big, there's lots of moving parts, that's going to take a little while longer before it comes out. And in terms of one other piece of legislation on cyber, last December, I was very pleased that one of the bills that I introduced, along with Republican Senators Hassan and Portman, was one that made sure that the cybersecurity at our Department of Homeland Security was robust and upgraded. And it did this interesting thing, which is it allowed a program to have DHS go and hire white hat hackers to hack itself, to find out its vulnerabilities. So the Pentagon started this program. It worked well, and as elected officials here know, one of the best things you can do is copy what other places have done. So we basically took that model and said, DHS, you're going to do the same thing now. And I'm very pleased that the President signed that into law. And now I have additional legislation that does it to the State Department as well. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the national emergency that many of you are aware of, declared on Friday. So I'm just going to give you some facts. Be up to you what you want to do with these facts. So these are undisputable facts because these facts come from the Trump administration. Based on statistics from the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol, border apprehensions, which is basically a proxy for how many people actually cross the border, have decreased 75% from 2000 to 2018. That's just a fact. Based on the latest data from the FBI, we know that violent crime is down across the United States. We also know that property crime is down across the United States. And then, based on data from the Department of Homeland Security, we know that in terms of illegal drugs, 80 to 90% of it goes through legal checkpoints, legal ports of entry. So those are what the facts are. And if what the president wants to do is to redirect funds to then build a wall between ports of entry, it's not clear that any of that has anything to do with the facts I just laid out, right? If you really want to stop the flow of illegal drugs, you would upgrade ports of entry. You would make sure they had the technology to scan vehicles much better. We'll give them much more drug detection dogs. We can do all sorts of things to make sure that we do more at our ports of entry to stop the flow of illegal drugs. If you also look at what the president wants to do in terms of redirecting funds, one is he would take billions from the Department of Defense drug and addiction program. Really sort of stupid, right? If your goal is to stop illegal drugs and then take from that program to take a long time to build a wall that doesn't even really apply to ports of entry. So that's just sort of on the facts. By the way, study after study also shows that immigrants, both documented and undocumented, commit less crimes than native-born Americans on a per capita basis, on a proportional basis. However you slice it, immigrants commit less crime. So those are what the facts are. And you have a lawsuit now, you're probably gonna have several lawsuits that occur. One of the great things about our judicial branch is they operate based on facts. And we feel pretty confident that we will win these lawsuits. And one reason is if you just sort of see the timing of this. If this administration thought that this was a winning strategy, they would have declared a national emergency on day one, or 6 months into it, or a year into it. They wouldn't have waited over 2 years, then additional 35 days, and then a little bit more before they did this. So we feel pretty good just based on the facts. And then I'm just gonna talk to you about the law of this. So what happened was that Congress, on a bipartisan basis, right, funded government last week and specifically rejected the president's demand for $5.6 billion for a border wall. He got 1.375. If you look at the way the law is written, there is no way you can say that Congress intended to allow this statute on national emergencies to now let the president do an end run based on what Congress just did on bipartisan basis last week. So the courts would have to sort of say, well, Congress didn't intend to give him this money, but because of this other law Congress passed decades ago,